Hello and welcome. Uh, I'm Martha Jones from Johns Hopkins University, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this conversation today at the National Archives and Record Administration. I want to welcome our special guest, Professor Matt Clavin from the University of Houston. We're here to talk today about his brand new book out on Monday, Symbols of Freedom, Slavery and Resistance Before the Civil War, with NYU Press. Professor Clavin is a prolific historian. This is his fourth book, a specialist of the history of slavery in the Atlantic world and emancipation. And I'm really thrilled to be here with you today, Matt. Welcome to the National Archives.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to the National Archives. I'm very honored to be here and especially honored to have you available to have this discussion. So I'm very appreciative. Thank you.
Sure. Well, it's always a treat, isn't it, to get a preview of a book before it hits the stands, as we used to say. And this one is especially aptly timed to coincide on Monday with Juneteenth, our national holiday, and then just around the corner, the 4th of July. And I know we're going to talk about both of those occasions and how they fit with this book. But first, let me just say thank you for Symbols of Freedom. And I thought I'd just start by asking you, if I could, to take a few minutes to set up our conversation and introduce the book. I have lots of questions. I'm going to encourage folks to post their own, but maybe you could set up the conversation for us.
Thank you. This book is years in the making. Probably 20 years ago, I came across while I was in graduate school and I was in Washington, D.C. I'm a Baltimore native. And so I was always very interested in Maryland, D.C., Baltimore history, still am. And as I was in grad school, I was already writing my dissertation on one topic, and just in the archives, as we often do, we stumble upon things. And I came across this account of dozens of enslaved men from Southern Maryland who decided to make a break for slavery. And to get to Pennsylvania and freedom, they had to get through the nation's capital. They didn't make it. Most of them did not make it. They were eventually stopped near Rockville, Maryland. There's a big gunfight. Several are killed. Most are re-enslaved. Some are sold to the Deep South. 2 or 3 actually made it to freedom, which is pretty incredible. But what really was shocking to me is this happened over 4th of July weekend. And when unfortunately, and I've done the research, we don't have any of the words and the voices of those enslaved people, those fugitive slaves. We have no documentation of their motivations. All we know is that over that weekend, they escaped. And I was fascinated by that. And what I was also fascinated by was that all the Southern accounts of this it becomes known as a fugitive slave rebellion. So it's fugitive slaves who are armed and they eventually fight their potential oppressors. But what was interesting, all the Southern accounts, white Southern accounts, did not mention that coincidence of them escaping over 4th of July weekend. Whereas abolitionists, they took the ball and ran with it. And they had one famous writer and William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, he referred to these fugitive slaves as the disciples of the Declaration, because he assumed they must have heard the Declaration over 4th of July weekend and took off. And so I was very fascinated by the different receptions. And then ever since then, I've just scoured newspapers, pamphlets, correspondence, and have been just shocked. And after a while, I'm not shocked anymore. How many slave escapes, how many revolt attempts, how many slave plots, how many slave suicides. I mean, anything you can imagine, they occur on 4th of July or 4th of July weekend. And then this became a much bigger project. Clearly, these enslaved people understood the 4th of July. They understood the rhetoric of the Declaration of Independence, this idea that all men are created equal. And I found that it wasn't just the 4th of July. It's the American flag, it's the US Capitol building, it's the rhetoric of the revolution, like Patrick Henry's great quotation, "Give me liberty or give me death." I have found countless examples of enslaved people literally fighting to the death, and they exclaim, "Give me liberty or give me death." And these are enslaved people in Virginia and Louisiana in the 1800s. And so that's really the root of the whole project. And as it became a book project, and as I started writing it, this really speaks to our conception of not just patriotism, but nationalism. And that's a very heavy term today. And so I do get into those ideas and these large historical, philosophical, even issues. But at the root of it is slave resistance and also the abolition movement. And these people, enslaved and their free allies, they are demanding before the Civil War that the United States stop being so hypocritical, stop talking about freedom and equality, and let's realize it. And so that's that. I'm so inspired by the story of these people that I had to write the book, and I'm just really happy I've had the opportunity to do just that.
Well, you're already, I think, giving us a sense of how gripping some of these stories are, including that of the Rockville rebels out of Maryland that you feature in here. But I want to ask you, if I could, to spend a little time with us on this, and how you use the concept of nationalism. Because when I encountered the word and the idea here in this book, I couldn't help hear, if you will, kind of 21st century, right? 2023, where the term nationalism is fraught. In many contexts, we would even say, I think, pejorative. But you really want to, I think, if I could put it this way, you want to rescue the term and restore it historically, and put it in the minds, in the hands, in the thinking, in the actions of anti-slavery activists, but also enslaved people themselves. Tell us a little bit more about why we want to hold on to the idea of nationalism even here in 2023.
And I think early on in the project, I looked up the word nationalism in Webster's 1820s dictionary, and it's not in there. Patriotism is in there. So that's how new the term was. That's how new the whole idea of a nation state was, early 19th century. And so whereas today we have 200 years of history, and a lot of it ugly, World War I, World War II, and I could go on. And it's really not me. I'm borrowing from a lot of other historians of recent years, but also not so recent. And they have made this argument, Jill Lepore comes to mind, that we may not appreciate and like the look and feel and smell of nationalism today for obvious reasons, but it's still, number one, it's a powerful historical force, and we can't ignore it. We have to reckon with it. But then there's also this idea in the literature that, at least before the Civil War, nationalism meant different things. So I think just in general, the way I see it is patriotism is love of country, period, whereas nationalism is more love of country and either a feeling of superiority to other peoples, or maybe just a dislike or disdain for other people, rooted in sort of that self-pride. Today we call it American exceptionalism. And I find in the early 19th century that the word, and again, I'm borrowing this from another smarter person, is this idea of aspirationalism. And so it's sort of this idea, Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, so many other leaders at the time, they feel that the United States has incredible potential. And I think they would argue it has way more potential than any other nation on earth because of the Declaration's proclamation of equality. Because of the idea of freedom and equality. So the United States is born in blood, it's born in revolution, but it's also born in freedom. And clearly before the Civil War, freedom does not belong to everybody. But I think in the minds of a lot of these enslaved people, these escaped slaves who become abolitionist leaders, and we're talking black and white, male and female, rich and poor, they, in their heart of hearts, really do believe that the United States has exceptional potential. And so they have a real love of country, but it's critical. It's not, what's the word? Help me out, Martha. When you love somebody, no matter what they do to you, or no matter what you do to them, it's not unrequited love. It's called
unconditional love.
Yeah, it's like there are conditions. And the condition is get rid of slavery. Spread equality and freedom. On the 4th of July, stop talking about all men are created equal, because they're not. And so I think what is, I don't know if inspirational is the word, but probably what is inspirational to me is that these people who are they're just, their whole lives revolve around opposition to the institution of slavery, yet they find in America's core an exceptional ideology that they embrace. And we've seen this throughout American history, how frequently and in great numbers African Americans will enlist in the military, they will die for the flag despite being treated so poorly at home. And just one of the paradoxes of American history, the black role, the role of black people in the U.S. military, it's still underappreciated. And this is kind of related to that. Here's a love of country, but it's conditional. And until you get rid of slavery, we'll love them. And you hear Douglass and Garrison and so many others, they sometimes exclaim they don't love America. Or William Lloyd Garrison's great motto is, "My country is the world." But on other occasions, you hear them very explicitly saying they love America. This is their country. They're not leaving. They're going to fix it. So it really is an incredible story that absolutely, I think, needs to be told and understood by the public. Today, I think will help us understand some of the issues we're dealing with today.
So help us, I think, with a puzzle that I want to get to Douglass, but I first want to ask you about many of the lesser known, unnamed enslaved people who really animate this book. There's a puzzle, I think, for us about how it is that folks who are so ill-regarded by the state, by the Constitution, by American courts and more, still develop this sense of nationalism, as you describe it, conditional perhaps, but a powerful sense of nationalism. Right. Help us understand that a little bit better, and maybe an example that from the book would help us to appreciate that really complex and almost puzzling equation.
Yeah, and I think what have found is and there's a literature on this, but before the Civil War in the southern slave states, the meaning of the 4th of July changes, where it was originally intended to celebrate obviously American independence, but at the same time the ideology that all men are created equal, right? The language of the Declaration. And it becomes very concrete over the years how white Southerners, they start to intentionally, explicitly alter the meaning of the 4th to just become a party, barbecues, of foot races, anything you can imagine that's apolitical. They really try to depoliticize the holiday because they understand how subversive those ideas are in a slave society like the antebellum South. So at the same time, and there's discussions of how can we keep Black people away from the 4th of July. There are recommendations that this should be a whites only event. Keep the slaves at home. It doesn't happen. In many parts of the South, Blacks are in the majority. And so I have found just multiple examples of enslaved people who are participating in 4th of July celebrations. They are in an audience listening to politicians, great orators, reread the Declaration of Independence. They hear discussions of the 4th of July, all these political ideas. So even if you are illiterate, if you can access a 4th of July celebration in which they recite the great American idea that all men are created equal, that's going to have a powerful impact. So again, from Louisiana to Baltimore, far west to Kentucky and Tennessee, enslaved people are fully aware of these ideals and the United States' shortcomings. William Wells Brown is the best example, although there's many. William Wells Brown is enslaved in, sort of Kentucky and Missouri. He's in St. Louis as a teenager. And at one point he hears a US senator read the Declaration of Independence and give this great oration on the 4th of July. And later on, his daughter writes a biography of her father, and she quotes him as saying, "From the day I heard that oration, I was going to become free." And he really does try for a couple of years, and eventually he makes his way to freedom. And so white Southerners, they didn't do a very good job of keeping these ideas from percolating across the antebellum South. And one thing I've learned in my decades now of research and teaching, enslaved peoples in the United States for certain, is as isolated as they may have been geographically, they were still connected. They got word of things from the Caribbean. They heard about things in Europe. They knew the British were coming during the War of 1812 before they came, things of that nature. And so and I have written books, I've written articles about how so many of these global ideas, global revolutions, the information trickled down to enslaved Americans. And I think, and I even wonder looking back, did on occasion I forget that there were also these revolutionary ideas at home that also percolated and spread across the South. So I don't think of this book as an intellectual history, but it is a book about ideas. And you can interpret, and I use the terms rhetorical nationalism, and then there's the term revolutionary nationalism. And so you can go to the 4th of July celebration, you can read the Declaration and ignore it and go back home and continue practicing inequality and bigotry and all these things. Or you can, like the people I study, the enslaved people, their allies, they are taking the Declaration literal. More importantly, maybe, arguably, they're taking Patrick Henry at his word. And when he says, give me liberty or give me death, that's not rhetoric. That's not a joke. That's not nothing to be scoffed at. He's being literal. And like I said, I found enough evidence to show that there are a lot of enslaved people, and they are willing to die for liberty. And there's nothing more American than that.
You really show us, I think, how enslaved people, as I think of it, are really breathing meaning, right, into that text, right, imbuing it with meaning, with their own ideas, with their own interpretations, with their own actions, oftentimes in the story that you tell. But let me ask you about a moment, and because I want to come to Douglass. I think some readers will have encountered Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," and if they haven't, that is reason alone. Your wonderful chapter on that speech and its significance, that alone is worth picking up this book. But what I didn't know was how prior to that, as Douglass came back from Britain, now fully fledged as an anti-slavery orator and activist, he was branded a traitor. He was someone who, for a time, was regarded as un-American. I think today we think of Douglass as sort of the quintessential American, certainly the quintessential 19th century American. What was going on there that led people's minds to change about Douglass?
Oh boy, I could talk for hours. And thank you for your kind words about the chapter. Anytime you write about Douglass, it's intimidating because so much has been said and written about Douglass. And I definitely stand on the shoulders of really incredible thinkers and writers who have said a lot about Douglass. But two things I'll point out before I get to this third thing to answer your question. Douglass loved America, and his name, originally from his mother, his birth name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey. And 3 of those names we know the origins. We don't know where Washington came from. And I, like David Blight, one of certainly Douglass's most prolific biographer, think that this has something to do clearly with George Washington. Washington is the most popular African-American surname. It still is. So they're right there. So from his birth, there's a connection to him and the founding father. Another great story most people don't know about, when Douglass escapes and ultimately frees himself from slavery. He's in Baltimore and he dresses as a sailor, and a lot of free Black men worked on the waterfront and on the water at this time. So he had a friend who was a sailor, and he borrowed his sailor's outfit. And a lot of times you didn't look like a runaway when you looked like a sailor. But most importantly, he had a certificate, a seaman's protection certificate, it was called. It was an early sort of passport idea, if you will, to protect American sailors from being harassed and impressed abroad. But what's really neat about this whole story, and if at the National Archives they have, and I've seen them, some of these seaman protection certificates, and they're the coolest documents to look at, and it will describe the sailor, the color of his skin, the color of his eyes. But what is really cool is this American eagle that is imprinted on top of the document. And sometimes it's a little tiny eagle, sometimes it's a third of the certificate is this American eagle. And when Douglass is riding a railroad car through Baltimore. He's, a conductor comes by, asks for his, I guess, ticket and his identification. And Douglas shows him this passport or this protection certificate. And almost with an attitude, I would say, he says to the guy, something like, I have a paper with the American eagle on it. I can go anywhere I want. And it's him sort of saying, like, this eagle really represents something. This document clearly does. But in his mind, America, its symbol is this bird, and it represents freedom. And when he gets possession of that, he's a free man. So I think from the beginning, Douglas just has this affinity for the United States. And again, it's conditional. He'll be as critical as any American of the United States' laws and its policies regarding Black people and equality. But to answer your question, by the 1850s, he does a switch. He pretty much turns his back intellectually on all of his abolitionist mentors, Garrison at the forefront, and he becomes a champion of the U.S. Constitution. And so prior to him making the switch, most leading abolitionists, they sort of did not appreciate the Constitution. They were very critical of it because the Constitution is, in fact, a pro-slavery document. It sanctions slavery. It sanctions the slave trade for at least 20 years. It does all these things. Troops can be used to put down slave insurrections. So what most abolitionists would celebrate and talk about and champion and promote was the Declaration. They say that was our founding document. The Constitution is a pro-slavery text. I mean, it infuriated them. But Douglas finds in the Constitution anti-slavery tendencies. Doesn't use the word slavery because the founding fathers didn't want to, make it concrete, permanent. Doesn't use the word Negro or African American or any reference to a slave like that. It's legal jargon. It does refer to enslaved people as persons. And for Douglas, that's the biggest thing. And so as by the 1850s, he starts to argue that the Constitution, although flawed, can be read as an anti-slavery text. And so when he is invited by a group of women in Rochester, an anti-slavery sewing club, they invite him to sort of give this 4th of July oration to announce publicly or to explain to all of his newfound critics why he's changed his opinion on the Constitution. And if there's anything I love about Douglas, and I just love people in general, like iconoclast, and he's willing to challenge his best friends, his mentors, if he believes the opposite. Like he backs down from nobody. He will challenge President Lincoln during the Civil War. He challenges Garrison. He challenged his slave owners and overseers. I mean, he's just a defiant man, but not for defiant sakes. I mean, he's a freedom fighter. He's an American, true and true. And so he earns a lot of disdain from a lot of respected anti-slavery folks. And so that 4th of July oration, which he gives on the 5th of July on a Monday, is really his opportunity to explain why he now sees the Constitution as an anti-slavery text.
So you mentioned the 5th of July, and I'm going to take that as an opportunity to ask you about that day, because we expect, I think, you to tell us a story about the 4th of July, a day that we still mark as a national holiday in ways that are substantive and perhaps nationalistic in a sense, and on the other hand, that are those other traditions about barbecue and three-legged races and things like that. But here, I think readers will be surprised, I think, to encounter the importance of, say, the 5th of July or August 1st.
Right.
And so what of these other dates? How do they surface on the calendar in antebellum America? And what do they tell us about this struggle over the meaning of freedom?
And I think some readers will be very surprised to find out, as historians, sometimes we have to sort of summarize and almost generalize and oversimplify. And so there's definitely, the era that I'm talking about, the 30, 40, the decades between the War of 1812 and the Civil War, it's an era of supranationalism, but slavery disappears from the North and it only grows in the South. But you'd be mistaken if you don't appreciate that racism is national, so there's slavery and white supremacy in the South, in the North, there's no slavery, but there's plenty of white supremacy. And one of the darker chapters of American history is throughout this antebellum era. The 4th of July is a very dangerous day for Black people in the northern United States. From the East Coast to the Midwest, I mean, you would think this would be a day of all days for Black people to feel that maybe, they can enjoy citizenship. And no, it's the complete opposite. As you can imagine, white supremacists, some of these people are immigrants, some are native-born Americans, some are probably good people, and they get drunk on the 4th of July. And then it's a mob mentality, and they attack Black neighborhoods, they attack Black churches. There are, innocent Black people just, celebrating the 4th of July, sometimes inside of a church, for goodness sakes. And a white mob, raging mob, violent mob will break into the church, break into the theater, break into the home, and attack, beat, and in some cases kill people. And so, as you can imagine, for free Black Northerners, for their white allies, this is a sickening turn of events. And then, so you would imagine Philadelphia, where there's a huge riot, New York, there's multiple riots. Who wants to acknowledge, the greatness of America the next 4th of July? And the answer is not a lot of these people. And so what they sort of do is, and this happens early in the 19th century, is they start to find alternative days to celebrate American independence and the idea of equality, just not the 4th of July. So a lot of people, they will do the 5th of July in many cases. A lot of free Black Northerners sort of like this. It's like the next day. They will take to the streets in New York City and Boston and Philadelphia and really make an assertive show of their collective strength, their solidarity. They're Americans, but this is a new protest tradition. But without a doubt, across the North, for Black and white Northerners, August 1st really does become the preferred day for a holiday summer celebration. And August 1st in the 1830s, Britain does away with slavery in its colonies in the Caribbean and the West Indies. And many historians have found this so fascinating, how free Black Americans, they really come to appreciate and love Britain at this time. Fugitive slaves, people working the Underground Railroad, the goal is to get escaped people to Canada, which by the 1830s no longer has slavery. After the 1820s, get them to Mexico, get them to another country, another colony, another part of the world that doesn't have slavery. So these people that I study, despite their great affinity for the United States' founding ideals, they still oftentimes will say explicitly, their actions show that they also have love for other nations if they embrace freedom, if they embrace abolition, if they embrace emancipation. So I found, and not just in the antebellum era, but people have multiple identities at the same time. You can be a Northerner proudly, and you can also be a proud American. You can be a Philadelphia Eagles, football fan and love the Boston Red Sox. Doesn't happen often, but it does happen. I've seen it. So, I think these people have multiple identities, and anything that promotes the end of slavery, they have an affinity for, be it Britain, be it, Spain, be it the Netherlands, France, it doesn't matter. And when in the Civil War, the United States government finally comes around to embracing emancipation, then they're full throttle behind the United States of America. Finally, we're getting rid of the great cancer that has, dogged us since the 18th century.
And on this point, I think you see things differently when it comes, for example, to August 1st celebrations. I think some historians have regarded that as evidence of a Black nationalist or a Pan-African political worldview. And your answer is no. Say just a little bit more about that.
David Walker comes to mind, and I have written before. He loved Haiti. He just loved the Haitian Republic, what Haiti represented. And for the listeners who may not know, Haiti is the result of the largest, most successful slave revolt in world history, beginning in the 1790s. Post or during the French Revolution. Santo Domingo is a French colony. Hundreds of thousands of slaves rise up, rebel, and eventually they establish an independent Black republic. It's the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere beyond the United States. So David Walker is a free Black Northerner who was a writer and anti-slavery advocate, early abolitionist, and he writes a very radical pamphlet in 1829, 1828, 1829 called David Walker's Appeal, in which he just lays out sort of this philosophy of revolution and how, he justifies violent upheaval, he encourages violent upheaval, anything to get rid of slavery. So Haiti holds a special place in his heart. Like, he just loves what those enslaved people were able to do against all odds. And I would never say he doesn't identify with those people. He does. As a Black American, he identifies himself with these Black Haitians. They're Black people. It's very important to him. But I think what I have found that other historians have overlooked is that if you read his pamphlet, he keeps citing the Declaration, and he keeps talking about America's founding fathers. He keeps talking about the founding generation. He's talking about the white founders, actually. So I would say, to get back to my previous point, he is both a Black man and he's an American. So I would say, Walker, is all of his, biographers would say he's a Black nationalist, but I would add to that he's also a United States nationalist. And I think that's sort of the new, my way of looking at it, which is kind of innovative and original. And it's not to take away from his Black nationalism, but it's to say he can be more than one thing at the same time.
And I guess I think I hear important echoes there of course, the great W.E.B. Du Bois, who at the dawn of the 20th century is going to introduce to us this notion of double consciousness on the part of Black Americans. And so I think I importantly hear some resonances of that in what you've just described.
Right.
So let me take us away a bit from the symbol that is the 4th of July and the Declaration to some others of the symbols that also animate this book. And I want to especially ask you about the American flag. Last year, I had an opportunity for the Philadelphia Inquirer and their guest editor, Aaron Haynes, to write an essay reflecting on the meaning of the American flag for Black Americans. And of course, it's an extraordinary saga, as you really help us appreciate, that has powerful roots in the antebellum period. But let me ask you about something adjacent to that before I come back to the flag. And I want to come back to that scene that you introduced the book with at the US Capitol in the wake of the War of 1812. But before that, I wanted to ask you about companion symbols that, again, I think we may have forgotten about. Liberty poles and liberty caps. Yeah. What are those, and why are those in your book companions to the flag as folks, in a sense, make manifest their ideas about the nation, about freedom and liberty, belonging, and more?
Right. Well, the liberty cap specifically, dates back to the Roman Republic. And I was just teaching a class recently, and I stop and show images, and I always show how in the early American period, liberty is always portrayed, or typically portrayed, as a woman, Lady Liberty, and we get, 100 years later, the Statue of Liberty. And so just for Americans in general, and at least the educated portion of the population who studied ancient Greek and Roman, I mean, these symbols were very familiar to them. It wouldn't be familiar to us today. And so there's an incident I found in Savannah, Georgia, in the early 1800s, and a U.S. soldier who had fought in the War of 1812. He was from the North, and he ended up moving to the South after the war. And he hears this big commotion one morning. I guess he didn't realize it was the 4th of July. So he stumbles out of bed, he gets dressed, and he goes to the town square. And as part of this tradition in Savannah, Georgia, they erect this big liberty pole. And there's a big tradition in the American Revolution to have this huge liberty tree or liberty pole. Very symbolic. It's a focal point, a place to organize and to gather for resistance, or to celebrate for a great speech, a reading of the Declaration. And so these symbols, even if they're ancient, anything that represents freedom, they're basically appropriating them and trying to make them, or they see them as American symbols. The United States in their minds is the great inheritor of the ancient idea of freedom or political freedom. So back to Savannah, Georgia, this war veteran, he goes, and I'm sure he's anti-slavery, he goes to this rally, if you will, and people are yelling and screaming, cheering, guns are being shot off. because the big tradition of the Liberty pole is being lifted. And some of these poles are heavy, they're 50, 60 feet tall. There's usually a Liberty cap on top. And all of a sudden, this veteran realizes that the only people being used to lift this pole and to put it in its place are enslaved Americans, Black people. And he's just, he's disgusted by this. So everyone else is celebrating this party, this acknowledgement of American freedom. At the same time, enslaved people are working to lift this pole. And so he makes sort of this comment under his breath, like, this is kind of crazy. And someone standing next to him says, listen, sir, you better be careful how you say things like that around here. And to this day, I don't know if it was an actual friend who said that and was just sort of, nudging him, or if it was a complete stranger who said, hey, listen, guy, we don't talk like that here. But boy, that is a stark reminder of how different this country was hundreds of years ago. Enslaved people in Georgia being forced to lift this liberty pole. And so the word I use constantly throughout the book is just a mockery. It's a mockery of freedom. It's not, it's bad enough to have a liberty pole in a city rooted in African-American slavery, but to force enslaved people to lift that pole, equally disturbing are these slave coffles that are forced to march across the South. So you'll have 20, 30, 40 enslaved people, men, women, children, infants, chained together oftentimes. And someone at the front is forced to carry an American flag. And so it's bad enough to have slavery in a nation rooted in freedom, at least nominally. But it's really, I find, like these white Southerners, because slavery has become controversial, it's become sectional, even internationally, it's become a problem. I think they really take joy, if you will, or pleasure in sort of using these symbols and mocking them. And again, certainly they would say, we believe in liberty for white Americans, we believe in freedom for white Americans, but for the Black population, this liberty cap is a joke. This flag that represents white people, not Black people. And so what I do find is abolitionists then, they fight to reappropriate those symbols through their speeches, their writings, a lot of the images that they produce, the posters, the broadsides, the handbills. They use the flag, they use the U.S. Capitol building, they use the liberty cap, they use the liberty pole, and they try to bring that symbol back to what they argue, what I believe it was intended to represent, which was actual equality for all people, not just white Americans.
You're in the book and in this explanation, you really affirm, partly where I landed in trying to write about the flag over time, which is that it's very difficult to hold stable or to render the meaning of the flag in a sustained way over time, that it is a lightning rod, if you will, for controversy. But I think for us as historians, the place to look for understanding about the conflicts that are roiling through cities like Savannah, like Washington, D.C., and more. And you open the book with this extraordinary example of the slave coffle in the nation's capital in the wake of the War of 1812, in front of what is, I guess, really the shell of the Capitol. Right. And we discover through your rendering how there 200 plus years ago, the flag is a controversial symbol being appropriated and reappropriated, struggled over in real time in early America. And I can't help but think, and I know you invite us to think in this way, about how in our own time, in our own moment, we have seen some version of a replay of that very contest. So I don't want to draw you too much in the present, but I do think that because this is where you begin the book, you want us to I think, use this history
Right.
to some degree as a useful lens on the present. Am I right?
For sure. And I have special affinity for the US Capitol. I lived in Washington, D.C. for multiple years. I lived on East Capitol Street. I used to jog up the steps of the US Capitol. You can't do that anymore, but this was in pre and post 9/11. And so I really did. It's a beautiful building. The whole downtown area is incredible. And so the scene at the beginning of the book, this coffle is marched in front of the US Capitol, as it happened frequently, far more frequently than we would like to imagine. And on this one day, one of the chained men, he kind of pauses in front of the building. He faces the building. He lifts his chained hands and he begins to sing loudly what was then considered the national anthem, a song called Hail Columbia. And I find it very poignant that the last line of the original lyrics is death or liberty, or some variation of that. So it's a very, it's a call to action. It's a call to revolution. It's a song that was supposed to honor the founding fathers, the Revolutionary War soldiers who fought and won American freedom. So that Capitol building meant a lot to a lot of people back then. But I think the important thing about my book is that it shows it meant a lot to enslaved people as well. The Rockville rebels I talked about earlier, we don't have, none of their commentary survives. But I can only imagine what they were thinking as they marched up 7th Street in Southeast and Northeast Washington, D.C. They could see the dome to their west. And I imagine they took, they were already tired, they were hungry, and they saw that thing and they said, well, we're justified in doing this. We have all the justification we need to do what we're doing in that building over there. And then certainly today you see the U.S. Capitol, the U.S. the riot, how shocking that was to all of us. And so, like, that Capitol building, it's the quote unquote temple of freedom. And so here's a building, and yes, it's used for a lot of very important things inside of it, but it's also just a symbol, like the flag, like the eagle. It represents American freedom. And people have been fighting over it. People have been dying over that for a very, very long time. And so, yeah, my book is just totally rooted in the antebellum and Civil War eras, but it absolutely has resonance today. And I'm not afraid to say, and I think, freedom and democracy are in peril today. There's no doubt about it since the Capitol riot. I mean, there's no escaping that fact. And so we're at a really important point right now. And I just do think it's time to sort of reevaluate our symbols, our values. And again, we have to ask ourselves the question, is this the time where we're finally going to secure equality for all people, or are we going to keep limiting it to certain groups? And I think if we would listen to the voices of the men and women I studied, well, now is yet another opportunity to really stop doing things rhetorically and on paper. Let's make it, real concrete change. Let's remake, let's make the Capitol the temple of freedom again. Let's make the flag the symbol of freedom, the eagle, all of that stuff. And this is the moment. And so I hope the book helps people wrestle with some of these really important contemporary issues.
It's a perfect segue to my last couple of questions. And one of them is about violence and how violence figures in this story. I thought that I heard echoes of our colleague, historian Kelly Carter Jackson, who has really emphasized to us the ways in which Black abolitionists squarely, forthrightly, intentionally incorporate violence into their repertoire of anti-slavery. I think I read you suggesting that white abolitionists, to an important degree, follow their lead. And this means, I think, that even the valence of violence is more complex than I think we might sometimes allow for. Am I understanding you?
I think so. And I think a lot of people today underappreciate the violence of the institution of American slavery. And for many abolitionists are escaped slaves themselves. Several I've mentioned already. Harriet Tubman also comes to mind. And these people know in their heart of hearts that you're not going to convince slave owners through moral suasion or anything else like that to get them to get rid of this lucrative institution. And it's not only important economically, but socially, culturally, all sorts of ways. And as Dr. Jackson, Manisha Sinha, many historians have pointed out, the abolition movement is the pioneer of Black Americans. And white abolitionists play a huge role. There's no denying that. But Black abolitionists are not only at the forefront, they are always pushing it in a more radical direction. And certainly by the 1840s and 1850s, I found even in the 1830s, you have Black abolitionists saying, you know what, moral suasion sounds great. I'd love to be patient, nonviolent direct action. We can try everything you want. Non-resistance is what they called it back then. But you always have a Black cohort of abolitionists, and they say, no, it's time to fight. Or as Dr. Jackson says, use force. And violence is not preferred. It's not the preferred way. But the recommendation is made: if you're escaping, take a gun with you, take a knife with you, and if you need to, you fight liberty or death. And so eventually, certainly after the fugitive slave law, even leading pacifist abolitionists, white and Black, they come around, and if not, they don't promote certainly violent resistance, but they justify it. And they recognize that it's a viable option by the 1850s. And so another thing I think my book does just underscores not only the role of Black people in abolition, but their militancy and their tendency towards violence as the years and decades pass. And as the government seems to go more and more to the pro-slavery direction, as it leans further and further to the South, I think you see Black and eventually white abolitionists try to correct course by force, using violence or any other tactics necessary.
I can't imagine a more apt book for this season, these upcoming holidays, Juneteenth, the 4th of July, and more, August 1st and more. And I can't urge folks enough to pre-order, indie bookstore, your favorite local bookseller, but please take time to find symbols of freedom and let it really infuse these holidays with the long, deep, and powerful meanings that they have long held in this country. Before I let you go, Professor Clavin, I do have to ask, because I know what a prolific scholar you are, that you've got something else already in the works. So what's next for you? What can we look forward to?
Well, sometimes these projects, your next project has nothing to do with the previous project, and sometimes it's an absolute natural outgrowth. Well, that is the case in this case. And as I've sort of just mentioned, in so many of these encounters, there are lethal weapons at play. And if there's one thing I have discovered is that America's gun culture is not new. It has been around for a long time. And so what I'm looking into now in the next book will be on the role that guns, and also like the Bowie knives that Southerners fancied, the role that these guns and knives played not only in the oppression of African-American, people, but also slave resistance. And so these weapons in many cases in the South are intended to obviously support slavery and to keep African-Americans in captivity. But just as often, they are used for the opposite reason. Enslaved people who have access to these lethal weapons are not hesitant to use them. And then, of course, there's the abolitionist. As that movement grows more and more towards violent abolitionism, there's a lot of embracement of violent armed resistance. And so it's a natural outgrowth, and it's a exciting project, and I'm knee deep in it already. So it'll be in a couple of years, but it'll be out soon.
Well, I'm going to look forward to the chance to talk to you about what promises, again, to be important and provocative work. And with that, I'm going to thank our audience on behalf of the National Archives. Thank you to our archivist of the United States, Colleen Shogun, And a special thanks to our guest today, Professor Matthew Clavin.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you to the audience and to the National Archives. It's been my honor and pleasure, sincerely.
Goodbye, everybody.
Bye-bye.